Okay, good afternoon. It is that magical hour of the Audit Committee. Welcome. And we have don't have a very extensive agenda today, so we will dispatch with it forthwith. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Okay. Thank you very much. We have 3 items. First of all, it's the internal audit summary update. And we can just, do you want to walk through that, Jim or Annalisa?
Hi there. Yeah, well, I'll go through the summary update, and then Anissa will go through the report that we've issued. So the summary really is that we're executing on our plan currently. We've issued 1 report around cash handling, which I mentioned Anissa will go through. We have delivered the cyber intelligence workshop to city management and staff. My understanding is that went fairly well and had good response from the management that attended. The observation status summary, really we've just issued the 1 report, so there's really not any status to report other than to say that we will track that and follow up on those findings. The one thing to note is in this is it says 1 high and 1 medium. It's actually 2 medium, just a correction there that we noticed as we're preparing. The reports issued, again, cash handling. The one thing we'll move to is the dashboard. Again, it really talks to what we just discussed around the 1 report being issued. We are in the reporting process around the Freedom of Information Process Assessment, and we'll have that report issued in the next few weeks. And then just starting a couple other reports around management compensation process assessment, and just going through the charter development around the building permit process assessment. The activities that will take place in the next couple of months are indicated on the right side of the dashboard, and really talking to what I just discussed. And then some of the tracking around some of our key performance indicators. There's not a lot of data there, but we seem to be on track from that perspective as well. So with that, I'll pass it on to Anissa unless there's any questions to talk about the cash handling report.
And for members of the committee, this is our first really look at the format. Okay, so as we go through this, and I actually just made the comment to the clerk that in the future I'd rather see these first 2 reports, which will be continuous each time you'll bring them forward, updated. Probably they'd be better dealt with after the actual report of the meat of whatever the topic is of the day, because it's kind of, okay, so here's where we're going in the next little bit, right? So if there's any formatting or ways, this would be a good opportunity for you to make those observations, not just the substance of the report, but how it's presented, because we're kind of setting the template up for the next several years. And this is a little bit of the back and forth we've had with our friends from Deloitte. It's just what's going to get us to where we all want to go, okay? So, Anissa, why don't you take us through Parks and Rec cash handling process review.
Perfect, thank you. I will, if you can just draw your attention to page 6, we'll start with the executive summary. So Deloitte did perform a review of the city's park and recreation cash handling processes. We started the review of the fieldwork in June, and we completed our fieldwork in April. In terms of the internal audit, what we were looking to ensure is that there were adequate processes and controls within the Parks and Recreation cash handling process. The areas that the scope focused on was ensuring that there was an appropriate control framework to manage the cash transactions, cash deposits, and cash reconciliations within Parks and Recreation. We also wanted to ensure that there were processes to monitor cash handling within the facilities, and also compliance with the established directives and policies that the city had in place. So those were the 3 key areas that we focused on within the review. In terms of key strengths, we did identify a few strengths within that particular Parks and Recreation. The first one being around the preparation of bank deposits. There were effective procedures that were in place and they were implemented as well as being followed. The use of the class point of sale system, again, it was effectively utilized and there were very good automated procedures to ensure that the transactions were dealt with accordingly. And also another strength would have been the payment received prior to facility access. So here ensuring that customers did pay prior to entering any of the facilities and the processes and controls in place were adequate in that regard. In terms of our key observations, Deloitte did identify 1 high and 2 medium priorities. I would just like to state, though, that we did not identify any fraudulent transactions or any misappropriation of assets. Our findings are merely focused on process improvements within Parks and Recreation. So our first high priority item is in regards to governance, which is looking at monitoring of cash handling practices. So here there is an annual process within Parks and Recreation where locations self-report cash handling exceptions to corporate finance. What we did identify, though, is that there's no continuous active monitoring and oversight throughout the year to ensure that the controls are working appropriately and that the control framework is in place. So our recommendation was that management should work to establish oversight procedures more on a continuous basis to ensure that the oversight function and monitoring is occurring. Management did agree with the recommendation, and they are developing a risk-based framework to be able to deal with oversight throughout the year. Are there any particular questions on observation 1?
Or maybe let's just walk through them and
Wanna go
then we'll
through all of it?
cycle back if
Okay.
that's okay.
Sure. Okay, observation 2 is a medium priority observation. And here we sampled various locations and we performed various tests at the various locations. And we identified some areas of noncompliance against the corporate administrative cash handling policy and the petty cash policy. And in some of these cases, these items were not self-reported or self-assessed in the annual declaration, which would have been the expectation. So here, what we are recommending is that management just redefine and recommunicate with the various locations what the expectations are. Management within Parks and Recreation, they did agree with the recommendation and they'll be working collaboratively with finance to be able to indicate a way to communicate effectively and ensure that these various locations are following the expectations. And finally, the third observation is in regards to the cash handling practice. So here we've identified that the cash handling policy and directive was last updated in 2011, and there are some enhancements based on our review that we identified that should be included within the directive, as well as some clarification around practices in terms of keeping documentation around training and what the expectations are. Management agreed with the recommendation, and enhancements will be made in terms of the directive going forward. So overall, our rating for this particular process is we identified it, it's between a B and a C, which would be moderate process. Weaknesses identified, but based on the management comments as well as the agreement with the action plans, we do also identify that management has procedures and plans in place to make improvements, and we have no issues with their action plans going forward.
Okay. My perspective is this is kind of the level at which we would get a report from Deloitte, and behind it you have all of the detailed observations, and just by way of sort of an overview of that, you'll note different than what we've had in the past. You have their observations, the implication, their recommendation, and then you have management comments and who's responsible to implement any action plan. And it would be in that management comment, if there was a difference of perspective, that would be noted. And in this case, there isn't. So appreciate that. So that's just by way of sort of orientation. I'll look to, Scott, did you want to comment, or shall I turn to committee?
Through the chair, we can turn to committee. We're pleased with the process and work cooperatively, and I have Scott Oldham here to answer any specific questions to the process as well. So, yeah, we're open to questions.
Okay, Councillor Turner, I saw your hand before, and then Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To start off, I really like this format. I think the audit format really gives the detail. It talks about what processes were done as an appendix, so what exactly was done with staff, what key parts were looked into, and how they were looked into, and that really satisfies a curiosity of mine when we go through these audits. So far, nothing jumped out at me in terms of format modification, but I find this really helpful, and in fact, I think it's an improvement over the previous reporting. So to start off with that, with respect to the first recommendation, you said that no, I guess. No fraudulent activity was identified. You raise it as a risk, obviously, because there is the potential that the way that the current policies and the current practices are in place, that it would be, is it because it would be difficult to identify an elopement of funds as a result of the way things are set up now, or is it a theoretical, or is it a fairly material risk that something like that could occur?
Within a given process, what we would typically like to see is that there's active monitoring and oversight. So in this particular control, the city was more reflective on, let's look at any issues on an annual basis, but typically what you would expect to see around cash, within the city there is about 3 million of actual cash that runs through this particular department, is that there should be more active monitoring and oversight. And that's why we raised it as a risk, because if you can be preventative as well as detective more on a continuous basis, then it just helps your process work more effectively.
Thank you. And I do notice it's about 25% of the transactions, or the value of transactions, is cash, and about 3/4 of it is through other means, probably electronic funds. Does that have any implications for things like size of float or frequency of deposits or anything like that?
The city has their expectations laid out around the floats as well as the continuous basis for deposits. So no, I wouldn't necessarily say it would have a direct impact.
Thank you. And with respect to the 2.0, with respect to lack of adherence to policies and procedures leads to practice that are not aligned with the city expectations and requirements. So there's a recommunication of expectations. Especially with financial policies and cash handling policies, I think there's kind of two vulnerabilities. One is with policies and procedures in general, the chance for a general staff review of PNPs is not conducted frequently in most organizations. It's difficult to execute. It's difficult to get sign-offs to say that these staff members have reviewed on this date. Is part of this beyond just making a recommendation that we recommunicate the expectations, that there's actually a cash handling policy review frequency that's expected by staff? And the other part to that is certainly in Parks and Rec, there's a seasonality to the employees, to a large portion of the employees. So I'd imagine that there's the opportunity upon hire. Does that get redone on rehire each subsequent year?
That's where observation 1 is the overarching governance observation, that if there is the continuous monitoring and oversight, that you'd be able to identify any of the outliers on a more consistent basis if the policy or directives were not being followed. And also within our observation 3.0 is where we recommend the training material as well as having standard documentation of what the expectations are within a given process. So within the seasonality of the cash handling, that as you have new staff or employees enter various positions, the information's there to review and go over with them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report. I too like the format. I found, even though it was repetitive, I do like the details, just going through it over and over again, and I think that is important. The priority heat map, it is important. I wasn't too sure about the conclusion and the scale and how that works. I don't know if the definitions should be part of the heat map, but I just found that a little bit disconnected. And I'll sort of just leave it with you, but overall, the format, I do appreciate the details. I do have a question, not sure if it should be to staff. Regarding the observation number 1 in particular, about staffing, the need to do that extra bit of monitoring that's observed in number 1, are there concerns that we may require extra staffing, or just would like to hear back from staff on that?
Through the chair, no, we don't believe that what we worked out in the process we plan to work on will require any staffing, any additional staffing.
And the other question I had when reading this report, I know we're talking about cash, I just wanted to know if checks were looked at and how that works into the overall risk management of this report.
No, this one's focused specifically on cash.
I know checks aren't used as frequently as they were in the past, but I just do wonder how they're looked at. I know through my dealings in business, checks and cash were kind of combined together, but I'll leave the committee with that comment.
Isn't it interesting, right? We go to the swipe cards and know, what's a checkbook? My kids have no idea what a checkbook is anyhow. Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you, I'll also say that I appreciate the sort of iterative nature of the report going into greater depth. We can dig as deeply as we want, and the appendix with the detailed scope gave me a great deal of confidence. I can see all the things we looked at, so that that was great for me. Couple of questions. One regarding the safes. So I can see that the policy recommended would be good for an employee. I think the worst thing would be to share the combination of the safe with somebody else who cleans it out and blames me. But are there other reasons why we wanted that degree of to change those policies or tighten up those policies? So that's my first question.
Anissa?
So as we went through the review, we had done a compliance with what the city has within their directives, and that is one of the particular items of an expectation that the city has. So we pointed out where it didn't align or there was non-compliance in that particular area.
Thank you. And just following up on that then, you're looking, and I see that happens in a number of places where you're looking at where the city's policy is being adhered to or not. Were there many places where you thought that, or any places where you think our policy should be changed? Is that particular policy an adequate one?
Yes, so in observation 3.0, this is where we point out some of the additional items that we would hope to see within the policy going forward around the training requirements as well as the documentation maintained over the given processes.
Okay, that's great. And perhaps my last question was regarding the monitoring of this. Were there discussions, or did you have suggestions for the staff on how to monitor these on kind of an ongoing basis? That was one of your recommendations, is that they look at things from time to time to see how it's going. So this might be a question for you or to staff. what kind of ideas have we come up with for monitoring and checking that things are working the way they should?
Yeah, I was at that meeting, and we did have some discussions about what the plan might be, and the fact that, monitoring can't be something that is, that they have to look at the cost benefit of the monitoring. So you wouldn't want to check every week or something like that. That would be onerous. But look at when we use the words risk-based, look at it from a risk perspective and try to identify how often you'd go to the different areas and confirm that the policies are in place from a monitoring perspective. And then it might be, some of the things we discussed are that nothing is final yet, but they're working on it. But you might have a policy that, areas that have had errors in the past, you might go there more often, or areas that are closer to the city hall and have more procedures and commonality, you may go less often, those sorts of things, and use a risk-based approach so that you're using your resources as effectively as possible to ensure that the policies are being followed.
Okay, that's great. That's something we're doing at London Hydro, just kind of cycling through the department and just checking, here's a policy, did it get fulfilled this week? And check, and then move on to the next one. So I think Mr. Stafford has a comment. I'm sorry, looked like Mr. Stafford had a comment.
That's okay, thanks. Through the chair, I just wanted to comment a little bit on the SAFE and the different practices that we have in Parks and Recreation as well that create a challenge to sort of one common policy. And that's where we're going to work with finance and try and come up with some of those exceptions. And we currently annually work with them on an exception report to that. But for an example, is a small room at Storybook Gardens is quite substantially different than the large service counter we have at City Plaza. And those are some of or the service counter, we might have the aquatic center or something like that. So there's some different challenges based on the physical landscape and the space available and the type of transactions that happen versus, a $5 for a ride versus signing up for your season rental for a baseball diamond or something like that. So there's some varying differences that we're working on as well that we'll work with finance to try and come up with some commonality, but variances based on the areas that we're dealing with. So I just wanted to add that as a bit of commentary. Thanks.
Thank you. Through the chair to our internal auditors, I appreciate the report, and one of the questions I have is around the number of locations that were looked at and the timing of the actual field work. So, Parks and Recreation, as was just mentioned by our staff, it varies a lot. Like, there's a lot of different things that are going on within Parks and Recreation. It's also seasonal in the sense that, I imagine the cash flow is not even throughout the year, and it's, golf business is very different from Storybook Gardens. So I wonder, in terms of when we were actually in the field and where we went for the samples, your level of comfort with, what we looked at and when we were looking at it, and in terms of how representative that is across all of the transactions over a year.
Sure. The fieldwork took place between June and August, and we spent time with management during the scoping of the review to identify where the fluctuations are, where more of the higher risk was. So within our samples, we focused on areas where there were higher cash, as well as higher fluctuations, maybe particular areas that we possibly knew that controls weren't working as effectively as they could, so we could have honed in on that, as well as focus on other locations that maybe are doing things quite well also, so you get a rounded approach in terms of the samples that we looked at.
Just a brief follow-up, and that's helpful. When you say more cash, do you mean proportionally more cash or more cash by total volume? Like, it's just a really heavy cash business?
More cash by total volume.
So I want to reiterate some of the comments as well. I thought the report was very well done. I think the executive summary really helps us hone in on what we're looking at. I think the only commentary I'd have with respect to that is maybe just some more assistance with the so what. Because I noticed that it appears from the report, we know that the people aren't getting a free ride, so we have adequate control so that people are coming into the door and they're paying. But a lot of the control weaknesses stated that it was that you might not have an expectation. So the sites might not be providing information that's expected of the city. So just saying that could either be fraudulent money leaving the door, or that could be revenue recognition. So just something to help to identify the significance, so what. The other question I had was with respect, just if you can remind us, this particular section, there was a comment that said that management was well aware of some of these issues. Can you remind us if management put their hand up and saying, this is an area we'd love Deloitte to come look at, and just sort of provide some more color there, because it appears that, again, the commentary is that you worked very well together and that this was hopefully very beneficial. So I just want some more color on this particular section.
Thank you. In terms of the management awareness of some of the areas of improvement that were needed, that's because through the city process, they have the self-declaration every year. So in some cases, some of the items that were pointed out were within the self-declaration, but also recognizing too that there needed to be more active monitoring. So that's where the management awareness is. But again, it goes back to Jim's point. You have to look at the cost benefit analysis in terms of what is the actual true dollar value of cash, maybe going through that particular location, looking at how you'll assess the segregation of duties and those types of items. In terms of why cash handling ended up on the audit plan, was as we were cycling through the discussions with counselors as well as with management, it was an area that was identified to look at. It wasn't necessarily a particular concern, but within your audit plan, you'd like to have a mix of process as well as compliance-based auditing, and that's why this particular item ended up in the plan.
And just to follow up, because I noticed that the management's going to come back, it looked like May 18th for most of them. Can we just talk a little bit about the expectations? Is it just management that will come back? Will Deloitte take a second pass at whatever recommendations are put through? Just so that maybe the committee has some idea of what to expect.
Our goal is that as management completes and implements their action plan, Deloitte will spend time with management to review and validate the implementation of the action plan to ensure that it was appropriately implemented. And what we'll do is at that time, depending on when the meeting is, we will report back. We call it an observation summary that will outline the open observation, if management has closed it, if internal audit has closed it as well too.
Yeah, and to that section 2 of the memo at the front, there would actually be a report that would be attached to that, but since we haven't issued any reports, there's nothing there, but that would form part of the future meetings, would be a status report there.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Clark. I think that it's very good observations, and seeing that loop back at the end is a really important part, and one of those things that I think we've talked about a fair amount at this committee too in the past. So it'll be incredibly helpful for us as each of these kind of get checked off and the loop is closed. One other question that I had was recognizing that the value is well below the materiality threshold. What was the observed variance between the expected and actuals in terms of cash receipts?
Yeah, I don't think we covered that in the report. It was more a focus on the process. And as we noted, we didn't find any fraud or inaccuracies, so really we wouldn't have anything to report from that perspective.
I guess through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, any perception, I guess, I'm thinking back to my days as a young retail employee and going nuts trying to balance my till at the end of the night. Is there a sense of how accurate those reportings are at the end, and what amount of variance there is between the expected versus the actual received?
Through the chair, sorry. We worked with Deloitte to take transactions from customer interaction to hit to the GLs. And correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't encounter any issues along that way.
Okay. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to our internal auditors, you've had a chance to work with our staff and see the city a bit now. Going forward, is there any adjustments you're going to make to that process? How's that relationship going?
We found the process to be very collaborative, and we're still learning the culture within the City of London, but I mean, going forward, I think that we'd still continue with the same processes that we're doing. I think the scoping meeting is very effective in terms of understanding the process, understanding the risks from management's perspective, what management has self-identified, and some of the focus areas and awareness they would like us to spend time on, and at the same time recognizing what we would typically like to see within a given process, so finding the balance within the control frameworks as well.
Thank you, and maybe one more question to Mr. Stafford. There was a discussion in here about the inventory of items. So I'm guessing there's maybe things in the gift shop at Storybook Gardens that are being sold. And I'm wondering, are those things scanned and keep track of, or do we just buy a bunch of them and count them every once in a while? To what degree is that automated is my question.
Storybook's new to my portfolio, so I'll answer to the golf inventory, and I would assume it's the same, but I'll ask Scott to address that as well. But there's certainly the URL codes, and it's scanned and inventories electronically tracked in most of our areas. But I'll get Scott to address Storybook if he's aware, but if not, we'll find out for you.
Through the chair, yes, we have a inventory management within our point of sale system, and we log items in, and they're automatically tracked out. In addition, we have a quarterly hard count to verify.
Thank you.
I would really do want to ask how many golf balls we have in inventory, but you don't need to answer that. And I also suspect that if we had URLs back in the day, we wouldn't have lost Slippery the Seal from Storybook. Anna?
Yes, just one other question I have to the internal audit team about looking at other municipalities and seeing what their framework looks like. I know you did this in this detailed scope, but how do you look into, or how do you prioritize what is important, I guess, in looking at other municipalities and what that relationship looks like, if you do that, in fact?
So for the different reviews that we would execute, we would do a benchmark in terms of the City of London against other municipalities as well too. So what we would look at is comparable size, we look at the comparable process, and we'd also look to see if there were any maybe other particular controls that different municipalities had that the City of London didn't, or vice versa as well. And usually, typically, as you go through the benchmarking exercises, management would typically do their own internal benchmarking as well to have a strong understanding of what certain municipalities do. So it is very much an easy conversation back and forth.
Okay. So thank you for the good work. I have just a couple things afterwards to address the committee on. But I'll take a motion to receive the 3 reports with the recommendations. Okay, Mr. Cooler?
And to implement the recommendation?
Yes.
Yep.
And seconded by Councillor Turner. I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none opposed, thank you very much. Just looking at, I guess it was item on the dashboard, item number 2. So February 7th, we have our next audit meeting on February 7th, followed by June 20th, September 12th, and November the 7th. Just for your information. At least that's where we're headed at this point. You know, we try and make sure we work in reports in a timely manner so that they're not complete and sort of sitting on a shelf waiting for us to get to a meeting. I'd rather us have a very, rather a relatively short window of a report being complete and it getting to audit committee so that implementation can start as quickly as possible. And often implementation is well underway and we're kind of playing catch up, and I'd rather avoid that situation. So I anticipate that in February, we'll have the Freedom of Information Process Assessment and the Management Compensation Process Assessment will, in all likelihood, be on our February 7th agenda. And that's my expectation. And I'm sure Ms. Barbone and Mr. Hayward can let the various departments know that that's what we'll be looking for, which means they'll be completed sometime in the mid to late January timeframe. Does that seem realistic?
Yes, I think most likely as well, hopefully building permit will fall within that timeframe.
Okay, fantastic. Yes.
Thank you. There was, I don't know for additional matters, but there was an item that I would like to see a little sooner than perhaps is on here. And just a specific component of the procurement process assessment. We're going to be getting soon from our engineering staff a report that we asked for, I guess, back in 2015, just on what money might be able to save if we took some engineering services in-house. And one of the things that I thought might go well with that was a sense of how competitive that engineering bid process is. So I think you'd be well aware that we have a process whereby we bid for public engagement, and then usually we just grant the same engineering firm the design, and then we grant them the construction oversight. And then it's usually just justified by the fact that their bid falls within engineering, what we'd expect from engineers. And I wonder if that's as competitive as we could be. So that's one of the things I would like to see sooner than later.
I'm not really versed on whether the engineering, but I think what we can do with that, I'll take that as an inquiry, and perhaps Mr. Hayward and Ms. Barbone can have a look at what the report is that you're referring to and how these two processes dovetail. And if it makes sense to, flip something up like the health and safety assessment, or, to move something around that would make that a more thoughtful process, maybe I'll put it that way. That would be good. There may also be on the procurement, while it's all focused on process, there may also be a value for money opportunity to look at in that context. So if we can take that as an inquiry, and then they can maybe report back to us at a high level on that at the February meeting. How's that? Okay. Great. All right. Seeing no other additional business, I'll look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hopkins, second by Councillor Van Holst. Call the question. All in favor? All those opposed? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Thank you very much. And for those of you who drive safely. And I must say, we don't get to see you before Christmas, so have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas.